to the Emperor's Ring. I am the Emperor, Jeremy Davis, and this is my ring, where I discuss kayfabe and professional wrestling. I'll explain how kayfabe is what makes professional wrestling so bizarre, by going through key storylines, explaining key terms, and explaining professional wrestling in general. Well, let's get to the main event. To allow audience who are not familiar with professional wrestling, this first episode I will cue in some of the others on some of the history of the business. I will also take a closer look at World Wrestling Entertainment's history and how we got to where we are today. Professional wrestling started in the late 1860s and 1870s after the Civil War in America. Professional wrestlers were athletes who had wrestling backgrounds and would be part of traveling carnivals. Before the carnival would take place, people would go to bars and talk up the wrestler, saying stuff like, "He's the toughest guy alive and nobody can beat him." Someone would take on the wrestler for about 5 cents, and if he was able to defeat the wrestler, he would win 50 cents. A wrestler would put the guy in the sugar hold and then give him a slap to the chest. Usually the crowd would get rowdy and upset, and the guy would stand up and ask to take him on. The promoter would say the wrestler needs time to prepare for another match and would tell him to come back the following night. Both the guy the wrestler fought and the guy who stood up were all part of the show. The guys were there to keep kayfabe alive and make the wrestler look strong. Kayfabe is what the events of wrestling that makes it seem real, usually referred to now as worked events or part of a storyline. Kayfabe was created to make professional wrestling appear real and not staged. In the 1930s, the cat was out of the bag though. What was once seen as a legitimate sport was shown as modern theatrics, and kayfabe was broken. This was only known by a select few, and wrestling was still considered real to the larger audience. Eventually, instead of carnivals, promoters would create federations, which is how professional wrestling made the jump from carnival to a world-renowned show. Eventually, kayfabe became a word wrestlers used when staying in character, as wrestlers would have their own persona, and they would become that character when in the ring or when around fans that watched wrestling. This is when the idea of heroes and villains became an idea. Professional wrestlers who were cheered by the audience were known as faces, and wrestlers who were booed and treated as bad guys became known as heels. Although professional wrestling was known as not to be a true competitive sport to the audience of professional wrestling, kayfabe was very much still alive at this point, well into the 90s. People who were not fans were always ready to jump on fans of professional wrestling and telling them it's fake. David Schultz, a professional wrestler from the late 70s and 80s, was once interviewed by 2020 reporter John Stossel on December 28, 1984. Stossel started the interview by asking the standard question. He said,
"The standard question. You know?
Standard question.
I think this is fake."
You think it's fake? What's that? Is that fake? Huh? What?
"I think this is fake," narrated Schultz, then delivered a hit to Stossel's head, dropping him instantly, and then said, "You think this is fake?" Schultz then delivered another open hand slap to the 2020 reporter, which dropped him again, and then walked away. Stossel was shocked by the attack and decided to press charges, as he suffered from pain and buzzing in his ears for 8 weeks after the assault. This is a situation where Schultz was trying to maintain kayfabe as a wide audience of professional wrestling still wanted to believe it to be a real competitive sport. Eventually, kayfabe did eventually reach its end. On May 19, 1996, as an event took place that shook audiences, this is what became to be known as the Curtain Call. This took place in Madison Square Garden, and those who were involved were faces Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley, later known as Triple H, and heels Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. These wrestlers were friends backstage and were known as The Clique. But this friendship was only off camera and was not known by those watching the event. This was the last night Nash and Hall were wrestling for the WWF at this point. Nash and Michaels began in a rivalry at the moment and were facing each other in a steel cage, but after the match, when the cameras were no longer recording, Michaels helped Nash to his feet. Hall and Helmsley also came into the ring after that match. They all then shared a farewell and hugged in the ring and celebrated. This shocked the fans in the attendance. This was not part of the ongoing storyline. This was never shown on TV, but due to advancements in home camcorders and the internet, others soon found out. This event caused the kayfabe that was held up for many years to be completely destroyed on the spot. The secret was out. Nobody could deny the fact that pro wrestling was scripted and not entirely real. Now that the cat was out of the bag, this is what led to what professional wrestling is called today, entertainment. Another event that led to the end of kayfabe was in 1989. Vince McMahon, the owner of World Wrestling Federation, or as it's known right now, World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, testified in court to the New Jersey State Senate that wrestling was not a legitimate sport. This had more to do with rules and regulations than kayfabe itself. If professional wrestling was considered a sport, it would fall under the jurisdiction of state athletic commissions. Sports commissions in certain states have specific regulations that a sport has to follow, like having all the wrestlers be registered by that state. All wrestlers would have to pass medical testing by state licensed medical personnel. Also, an ambulance would have to be present in case of emergency. And these rules mainly portrayed to combat sports such as MMA, mixed martial arts, boxing, and wrestling. For a while, Vince McMahon had been working to get wrestling deregulated. McMahon didn't want to deal with the regulation fees if they were to break any rules, so they did what nobody thought he would. He had to let the world know that professional wrestling was not a legitimate sporting contest and was nothing more than entertainment. By testifying in court, he was to deregulate professional wrestling. Although McMahon did this to help himself, he was also helping other people in the wrestling business. People no longer needed to follow the state standards and regulations for starting up a wrestling company. Many people were also upset at Vince McMahon, though, for exposing the business to the world. Some people believe McMahon ruined wrestling forever. Since people no longer believe it to be real, it might stop people from watching it. Did this happen? Absolutely not. Throughout the 90s, wrestling began to grow in popularity. In 1997 is when WWE really blew up in popularity. On December 15, 1997, McMahon announced the start of a new era, the Attitude Era. He said it was the end of the boring bad guy versus good guy, and there would be no more superheroes, although this did change later on. This is where Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock began to become household names.
We've embarked upon a far more innovative and contemporary creative campaign that is far more invigorating and extemporaneous than ever before. However, due to the live nature of Raw and the War Zone, we encourage some degree of parental discretion as it relates to the younger audience allowed to stay up late.
This was to combat WWE's new rival, World Championship Wrestling, also known as WCW. Eventually, though, WCW was bought out by McMahon and WWE.
I do not believe what we've heard. Shane McMahon has bought WCW.
This was the end of WWE's largest opponent in the wrestling market. There were still some small wrestling companies, but none would ever reach the size of WWE. In the last 20 years, though, there's been plenty of wrestling companies that have come up. There's been Impact, also known as TNA, or it just has had many names, so it's confusing, but which was sort of a rebirth of WCW, but never reached the heights that WCW did. Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Combat Zone Wrestling have all been great places where younger wrestlers have honed their craft before they go to larger shows. This is where a lot of today's stars come from. My personal favorite of today, though, is New Japan Pro Wrestling, which has been around since 1972 but has began to grow larger and larger. In the last 10 or so years, it has reached incredible heights and it has been the home to plenty of wrestlers I call my own favorites.
こんなものはレインメーカーにとっちゃただの通過点だおい。ああこれからも半永久的に誰一人レインメーカーを止めることはできねえ。なんでかわかるかおい。
The newest kid on the block, though, being All Elite Wrestling, also known as AEW, which was just started last year, has already become a new rival to WWE. AEW is completely created by wrestlers for wrestlers. Former WWE wrestler Cody Rhodes and former New Japan Pro wrestlers, the Young Bucks, Matt and Nick Jackson, and Kenny Omega have all created this company to kind of combat WWE, and it's on Wednesday nights, and so is WWE's sort of third brand, NXT, which runs on Wednesdays, and they compete to see who gets the largest audience on Wednesday night. Kind of a return from the Monday Night Wars that WCW and WWE had in the past. It is still kind of shaking up at this point, as it's still ongoing. I mean, AEW just started last year, so there's more room to happen. But AEW even just recently released toys. It's kind of weird to say, but action figures, which is something that pretty much only WWE had. They had the largest market of wrestling action figures, and now AEW is releasing 2 series as of right now. And I think it's spectacular that there are such large wrestling companies that are just popping up left and right. And so it will be interesting to see how in the future WWE competes with AEW. But wrestling has been around for a long time and has given plenty of storylines and feuds to look through and analyze and just overall enjoy. Now, please join me next time, where I will be discussing the feud that got me interested in wrestling in the first place. We'll be taking a closer look at the feud between the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels and my favorite wrestler of all time, the self-proclaimed greatest of all time, Chris Jericho. This feud took place in 2007, and I will just go through kind of what happened and let you all in on this fantastic storyline that just really caught my eye and made me watch wrestling in the first place.
Is yet to come.
Well, that's all I've got for you today on that subject. Thanks for tuning in to the Emperor's Ring. I hope you learned a thing or two, but I'll see you all next time. Bye now. Music provided by bensound.com.